A GTO optimal play gone bad, or the biggest fucking equity punt in poker history? I am here with Dara today to talk about a infamous hand from the World Poker Tour Championship main event. Hello, Dara. You and I have not actually discussed the hand between Benny Glaser and Elliot Houdon at all yet, but lots of people have asked both of us about it. So this is going to be a pretty interesting video. I probably should just recap the hand before we get started. So it's six-handed World Poker Tour main event championship. Benny Glaser has a massive chip lead. He's got 91 big blinds. Elliot Houdon has got 48 big blinds, and everybody else at the table has barely more than 15 big blinds. The top prize is over $4 million. The next player out is guaranteed $1 million, and there's the payout after that is 1.3 million. So there's a $300,000 pay jump for the next player to survive elimination. Benny Glaser is under the gun with ace jack off, and with his 91 big blinds. Oh, sorry, and I should add to his immediate left, Elliot Houdon is there with 48 big blinds. Benny open shoves for 91 big blinds with ace jack off. Would you believe it, Elliot Houdon, who normally would have the easiest fold in the world with most hands, wakes up with pocket kings. Pretty quickly calls, to be fair, and suddenly Benny Glaser does not have a monster chip lead at one of the biggest final tables in poker history. So yeah, Dara, tell me about, before we jump into the hand analysis, tell me about what people were saying to you about the hand, what your initial instincts are, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I think recreationals found this play just completely bewildering. Couldn't understand what was going on, why anybody would shove there. Obviously, professionals know that there are spots where you make very large shoves because of ICM. And they kind of split down the middle. I mean, myself and David we were hoping to catch the end of the final table, but we actually got there after it ended, and Benny and his rail were walking out, and it was clear that even on Benny's rail, there was a split between, let's call them the computer says shove, so shove is fine, camp, and the guys who really thought it was a fairly big punt. That the shove was just an unnecessary risk. Yes, he was very unlucky to run into maybe one of the only two hands that can call him, but it was a risk that you didn't have to take. Yeah. I've written a VSO piece in which I compare it to betting on 35 of the 36 numbers on a roulette wheel. Most of the time it will work, and you'll make a small amount, but when it doesn't work, it's pretty catastrophic. And that was kind of my initial feeling on it as well. Until I ran the solve, I reserved judgment. I knew for certain, or I was 99.99% certain that it was a profitable shove. I didn't know for certain whether it was the most profitable play in GTO world. I suspected it wasn't. When people asked me for my opinion, for the most part, I was saying, well, I want to run the solve first. But if they really pressed me, I would say, well, if you back me over a barrel and make me guess, I'm going to guess that it's profitable but not optimal. That was the line I tended to use. So I was very interested to get home and run the solve. There are other reasons why I would never shove in that spot, which we can go into later. And other players that I spoke to, top players like Jack Hardcastle, actually said pretty much the same thing, that they would just have no shoves in that particular spot. But that's a separate discussion. What we're going to look at first is whether the shove is GTO or not.
Well, before we jump into that, my initial thoughts on the hand was I thought this was a perfect spot for some extreme ICM generally. Benny's got such a big lead. So many short stacks at the table. If you're in Elliot's position, the kind of correct strategy that we identified in endgame poker strategy in these spots is kind of to play for second and then see if you can get lucky heads up, because all these short stacks at the table, it's an absolute disaster if you go out before one of them. Ace Jack off seems like a pretty good hand to do it as well. You block the very narrow calling range. It's not the best hand to kind of open and then have to make a cycle if somebody reshoves on you. I think it works 99% of the time. In this respect, I think Benny was very unlucky to be running into one of the few hands that does it. If I was in game and it was for this sort of money, I'd be thinking, like, instead of open shoving, can't we just open to something massive like 8x, which achieves the same thing? It makes people realize that they're playing for stacks, but you can get away from Elliot if they come over the top of you. He's very unlikely to come over the top of you with a bluff. Before we jump into the full analysis, though, what are your thoughts on the call by Elliot? Because this was a spot that I felt was probably a pocket queen's fold, possibly a pocket king's fold too.
I think kings is too strong to fold. If Benny is shoving anyway wide, I mean, if we know for a fact he always has an ace, then yeah, it's a fold. But if he's going to shove some king X as well and other hands, Queen Jack suited, etc., we're just in great shape. I actually shared a cab to the airport when we were leaving Vegas with Jack Hardcastle, and Jack said that even though he knows that queens is a fold in theory, he would call in practice, because when you hold, and you will be ahead nearly all the time, when you hold, you win the tournament nearly always. Yeah. And I actually think that's a better point than we should fold kings, because we don't want to risk our tournament life. I think Bunga Cat ran a ICM in the immediate aftermath, which suggested that kings was a correct call, and the calling range was kings and aces, and that queens lost a small amount. But I think Jack said, yeah, I'll take that small amount loss for all the future equity I get. Benny was in an amazing spot. He could open a ridiculously large number of hands from every seat, including under the gun. The reason he's in that spot is because he has such a big chip lead. So long as he has that chip lead, he's going to have more equity at the start of every hand than every other player at the table. They have to be so tight. When the worst case scenario happens, as it did happen, and he gets it in and Elliot holds, the situation flips. He's now in Elliot's seat, and Elliot is in his former position. So Elliot has all of that, and it's no surprise that Elliot went on to close out the tournament. So I think that's a very legitimate argument for maybe calling it a little bit wider with a hand like queens. I don't think we should ever be calling tighter here, just because we want to lock up second place. And I was really impressed by Elliot. Elliot's very inexperienced. His first result, if you look at his hand and mop, goes back to 2019. I actually ran into Elliot in the corridor 2 days, actually the day before the final table. Had no idea who he was. The only thing he told me was that he'd read all 4 books and greatly appreciated them. So it's fair to say that Elliot is a relatively new player on the scene, yet he handled himself with incredible composure. There was another spot, I think, with 7 left, where a student of mine sent me a call he'd made with ace queen, which he thought might be a mistake. And when we ran it, we found that it was actually right on the line as well, but he had made the correct decision. So I think he was very well versed in ICM, and I also think he executed perfectly on the day. Okay, so this is HRC beta. This is the updated version of Hold'em Resources Calculator. It's significantly better than Hold'em Resources Calculator and other pre-flop solvers. And the most significant difference is it takes post-flop equity realization into account. And what I mean by that is that if we're analyzing just for the only options are shove or fold, then we just work out which hands are profitable shoves based on the calling ranges. And if we know the shoving range, we can work out which hands have the correct equity, since we're all in before the flop. But for more complicated hands where we're considering other options like limping or raising different amounts, then sometimes we won't be all in post-flop. And we have to take post-flop equity realization into account. What post-flop equity realization means is that let's say a hand has 40% equity against another player's range. That means that if you're all in against that player, or if it gets checked down to the river, you'll win 40% of the time. But if you're not all in, some hands will actually win more than 40% of the time, and some hands will win less than 40% of the time. Some hands will tend to flop very weak equity on the flop, but the opponent will see bet and we won't have the price to call and we'll have to fold. Other hands will tend to flop very strong draws or be very strong hands themselves over pairs or sets or whatever. And it doesn't matter how much the opponent bets, will be able to call.
So a hand like Jack 10 suited would realize equity quite well because it flops really well, and pocket twos does not realize equity well, right?
Exactly, yeah. Pocket twos will often be the best hand on the flop, but if it's looking at 3 overcards, it's going to have to fold. Jack 10 suited, when it has a very strong draw, it doesn't matter what the opponent bets, will be able to continue. If we're relatively shallow, if it hits top pair, it'll also be able to continue. There will still be times when Jack 10 suited has to fold away some equity, but there will be other times where Jack 10 suited can call and then will hit and will win more. And when it doesn't hit, it can fold and preserve money. So yeah, hands like Jack 10 suited, the very strong hands in our range, aces, kings, etc., they all tend to over realize. And hands that are easily dominated, like and unsuited hands like ace 2 off or low pairs, they'll tend to under realize because they'll just have to fold on the flop a lot. So we use this Monte Carlo hand, which means it's going to take post-flop equity realization into account. It's going to try and map out all of the things that can happen post-flop and see how much the hand will actually make as a raise or a call, as opposed to just its raw equity. So if we click on this, we need to set up all the stack sizes and the payouts. On the stack sizes, because this was a big blind ante, we can't just put in the stacks and blinds, because HRC is set up that every player posts a blind. But in this case, obviously the big blind is the only person who posts a blind. So the first thing we do is, because there are 6 players, we set the ante to 1/6 of a big blind. So that it will all add up to 1 big blind. I always, just as a point of style, I always set the big blind, the small blind, big blind to 500, 1000, so that it's very easy when we look at the stacks to know how many big blinds each stack is. So what I've done is I've taken all the stack sizes and I've added the ante for the guys who aren't actually going to have to post the big blind ante. But I've subtracted an entire big blind from the big blind stack because he has to post the full ante. So in this case, Benny started with 91 big blinds. So we put him in as 91 plus the ante. Elliot had 48 big blinds. So again, 48 plus the ante, 10 big blinds, 10 big blinds, 17. Started the hand with 9 big blinds. So we add on the partial ante, but then subtract the full ante that he actually had to post. To give us what he had behind, effectively. For the prize pool, this is the actual prize pool. I've added 10,400 to the first prize because there was a WPT seat for the winner. It shouldn't really make any difference. The important thing about the prize pool is just how flat it is compared to a lot of tournaments. A lot of tournaments are very top heavy. And you might see as high as 40 or 50% of the remaining prize pool up top. And in that case, obviously, the ICM is less extreme as you're more incentivized to play for the win or a top 2 spot. In this case, like we have 6 players left. So the average payout for them is going to be 1/6 of the prize pool, 16.66. You can see that we're kind of grouped around that. Even the guy who goes out next in 6th is still going to get almost half that. And the guy who wins is only going to get double. So because the payouts are bunched together, that reduces the ICM. It doesn't exactly turn it into a satellite, but it makes it more like a satellite than most payout structures would be. Also, if we just in passing look at the stack sizes, you can see, I mean, we basically have 4 short stacks, 17 big blinds or less, and 3 of them are 10 or less. So that really ramps up the ICM as well, particularly for Elliot.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because he should pretty much always come second or third from here. So busting a 6 would be a disaster for him. So he has to be super tight against Benny. The other guys also have to be pretty tight when Benny opens, because they could if the other players were all willing to gamble and get involved, there could be a scenario where one of these 10 big blind stacks, or the 17 big blind stack in particular, could just fold their way to third.
Yeah.
And that's a fairly significant increase in their equity. So everybody is under extreme ICM pressure except Benny. Benny and Benny really can apply the screw and will be able to play a lot of hands. Okay, so once we've set this up, and we're using ICM, obviously, we go next. We set up various options for the sizes. So I'm going to give Benny 3 sizes in addition to all in: 2 big blinds, 4 big blinds, 6 big blinds, and all in. I didn't bother changing the other options because it didn't get as far as them, so that it's not going to be part of our sim. These stats down here relate to essentially how complicated we're going to internally we're going to make the tree. This is fine for our purposes. If we were trying to get a 100% definitive solution and we were prepared to leave it running for weeks, we could increase these, but this will do for our purposes. For post flop, I'm just going to set up a couple of sizings for various options, allow donks, etc., etc. That's going to make the post flop more complicated, but it's also going to make the post flop equity realization calculation more accurate. So once we've done all that, we click finish. I know this is where you're going to cut. And we're going to go straight to this. And we are going to do this. Okay, so here is the solution. We obviously cut ahead here because this took over an hour to run. And you can see this is the line on top is what we're doing with the range. You can also see it over here. And basically the solver is just splitting between min raising or raising all in.
So that's the solver has completely disregarded what we suggested before we ran the solve, that the optimal thing to do would be to raise big, because it's effectively the same as shoving without the risk.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. I mean, we have to put a caveat here, which is that this is the latest solver, and this is the most accurate solver we have at the moment. But if we'd run this a while ago, we would have got a different. We could potentially have got a different result. And if we run it in a year's time, who's to say we don't get a different result? But just to try and rationalize why this might be, because this solver is accurately assessing post flop equity realization, it realizes that when we min raise and get called, that's actually a very good spot for us. We're going to win the pot way more post flop because of ICM. That's something that we covered in our book, and one of the phrases we used in Endgame Poker Strategy, the ICM book, was min or all in, which is that you will often, when you shove, they're going to have to fold more because their tournament is at risk, but they're also going to have to fold a lot, even to small bets. So you can make small bets for very little risk. We're seeing the same thing here pre-flop. The solver is essentially minning or all inning, and it's not doing anything in between.
It's the two lowest. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, sorry, no, go on.
No, I'm just saying it's the two lowest variance options. The min bet, you obviously risking the minimum, as the name suggests, and the all in is also a low variance option because it's just going to get through so often. Sorry, Benny, but it usually does.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to make that point, let's look how often the min raise is actually going to get through. When Benny min raises, Elliot is folding 86%, more than 86% of the time. The cutoff is folding almost 90% of the time. The button is folding almost 90% of the time. The small blind is folding more than 90% of the time. And even the big blind, who's getting an amazing price, 2-1, is folding 2/3 of the time. So this min raise is just going to get through a lot. And you can see it's already printing based on that, which is why Benny can open so many weak hands. Another point to look at is how often he gets 3-bet, and he's not even getting 3-bet very often. Elliot has to be super cautious. The only hand Elliot can really 3-bet for value is aces, and then he balances that with some weaker stuff. But really, that's only like happening 1.7% of the time. Most of the time when Elliot plays, he's just going to call. The 10 big blind stack, obviously, he's going to shove or fold, as will the button. Another 10 big blind stack. The 17 big blind stack and the small blind, you can just see that because he has 17 big blinds, more than the 2 10s and an 8, he actually, even though he's in a later position, he's actually the tightest player on the table. He can only play 8.6% of hands. That's because he's under such extreme ICM pressure.
Absolutely, yeah.
Even more so than Elliot, because Elliot can flat a lot, and he's only got put in 2 big blinds of his 48, so his stack isn't immediately threatened. But this guy can pretty much only fold. I can only shove or fold. He doesn't want to flatten the small blind. Ace is the only hand that's strong enough to do that, and he has to be super tight. He has to fold hands like 8s, or ace 10 off. So he's usually folding as well, and then the big blind, when he does play, is actually only, even though he only has 8 big blinds, is only going to shove 20% of the time. So again, we're just not getting shoved on very much either as Benny, and it just shows what a great spot Benny is in before this hand. So now if we turn our attention to what Benny should do with his specific hand, ace jack off. If we hover over the ace jack off, we can see it gives the expected value for each of the actions. Folding always obviously has an expected value of 0, and we're not going to be folding ace jack off. Raising to 2 big blinds makes $14,501. Raising to 4 big blinds makes $14,289. Raising to 6 makes $13,252, and shoving makes $14,069. So if we rank these in order, raising to 2 is the best. Makes the most. Raising to 4 is second best. Shoving is next best, and raising to 6 is the worst.
I mean, it makes sense for the hand too, I guess, because going back to equity realization, ace jack off is surely one of the hands that realizes equity pretty well, especially with shallow stacks. You know, we hit a top pair, we're going to go with it. Sorry, I think I've interrupted your train of thought with the.
No, not at all. No, that's a good point, I think. Let's just look at what the response should be that if we do raise this hand. If you can see, well, first of all, let's just focus on the hijack's response. Like the hijack, as I said, is not really, even kings doesn't want to raise and get it in, or potentially face a 4-bet. So everything below aces is actually just calling. He's mixing. He can't just call only with aces, so he's throwing in some other stuff too, like ace jack suited some of the time, ace 10 suited. But for the most part, he's just calling. And
to be clear, this is not because we're trapping. This is not because we're trying to induce someone to come over the top of us. This is because, for ICM reasons, we have to play the hand very passively. And I guess because we've got position, we're able to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you look at it, even a hand as strong as aces, it makes as much calling as it does as it does raising. Even though we would obviously be happy enough to get aces in. But another reason why we have to call our really strong hands here is that if we do call, we obviously set up a squeeze behind. And we need to have some very strong hands that can snap off the squeeze when that happens. So I think in practice it actually wouldn't be a mistake just to call your entire range here. You can see that there's no hand that actually pure raises. So we could just call our entire range here in practice. And I suspect maybe that's what Elliot was going to do. So we almost never get 3-bet. If we did get 3-bet, it's interesting to see what we do with ace jack. We would actually Benny should just call with ace jack. This would be Benny's response. In fact, Benny's doing not a lot of folding. He's folding whatever that works out, just about a third of the time. Benny is also under a bit of ICM pressure here because he only covers the guy 2-1. If he covered him by 10-1, it'd be a lot different because then he could double the guy up and still be a commanding chip leader.
Yeah.
But Benny's not incentivized to get in here either, getting too light. So you can see that even kings in Benny's spot is a flat. And then the other players, if they shove, let's see what we do. If the cutoff shoves, we're calling off with ace jack off. So obviously the button was the same stack. We're going to call him off as well if he shoves. Yeah. If the small blind shoves, we would actually fold because it's 17 big blinds.
17 big blinds. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
we know how tight the small blind was shoving to. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Look at that range. Like ace jack off is not in good shape against. In fact, ace jack off is ahead of nothing in that range.
Right. Yeah.
So therefore, it's flipping against some of the range. It's dominated by a lot of the range. So we would actually just fold. And that's another reason I think for the 2x to allow ourselves to fold. If we opened to 4x, we'd be getting a better price, and we might have to call off. And we'd still be in this bad shape against the shoving range. So yeah, so I think it's fairly clear that the min is the best option here. Now, that said, the margins are fairly close. Like there's less than $500 difference between shoving and min raising. So we can't even say that shoving is a big mistake. It still makes over $14,000. It's just that we have another option, which the solver thinks makes $14,500.
I guess this is where we see the limitation of ICM, because ICM doesn't factor in future game and it doesn't factor in skill. Benny is probably the best player at the table. I think that was quite clear, definitely by the hype going into the final table. So I guess these differences in equities don't really match up when you think about the fact that if Benny can keep the chip lead and utilize his skill, that's way more valuable than whatever equity he picks up with a shove. So that's what it doesn't factor in.
Yeah, absolutely. Benny's in an amazing spot here. The ICM is working in his benefit. He gets to pressurize other players. That means in every single seat on the table, including all the way back to under the gun, he gets to raise way more hands than usual. He can open more hands profitably. And the more hands you can open profitably, obviously, the better it is for you, because it's more likely you're going to be dealt one of those profitable hands. I mean, you can actually look at this. Like Benny gets to play 28% of hands under the gun. Sorry, more than 28%. I'm neglecting
like 50% or something.
Yeah,
nearly 50.
Benny's actually only folding. Yeah, Benny's only folding 50%. So Benny gets to play half the hands he's dealt, which is fairly incredible under the gun. If he does fold, the hijack obviously covers everybody. Elliot covers everybody behind him. He gets to play about 50% of hands as well because of that. But if he folds, the cutoff, who's short but in a later seat, can only play 25% of hands. The button can only play 31, 32% of hands. The small blind, because he covers the big blinds, gets to play almost 100% of hands. So you can see that like both Elliot and Benny, because they cover all the people behind them, can actually play more hands than those guys can play, even if they fold. And that's because of the ICM. So that's a situation Benny wants to preserve for as long as possible.
It's interesting that
go on.
Sorry, it's interesting that Elliot has the same kind of mixed strategy if Benny folded, because I think a lot of people would think that because there's only shallow stacks behind Elliot, that just the open shoving strategy would be the one that the solver would advocate. But Elliot still min raises half the hands and shoves half the hands. And the effective stacks are only 17 big blinds at best.
Yeah, but proportionally they're kind of similar, because like if you think about Benny's situation, he's got one stack behind him that's almost that's half his stack roughly. And then he has other guys who are very short. It's kind of the same for Elliot. Well, first of all, the guy behind him has almost half his stack, so he has to be careful because of that. He doesn't want to get in against him. If he gets in against him and loses, Elliot, is back down to 30 big blinds, and he's not even in second place anymore. And also the short stacks are a more significant chunk of his stack than they are of Benny's. If Benny loses 10 big blinds, it's no big deal. Elliot loses 10 big blinds, it's a bigger deal. It brings it back to 38, and it opens the gap between him and Benny, and it closes the gap between him and the guy on 17 big blinds. So that's why, even though he's one seat later, it's roughly the same. He won't have too many raised folds against the 10 big blind stacks, but he'll probably have quite a few against the 17 big blind stack. Actually, let's test that. So if he does min raise and the 16 big blind stack shoves it in from the small blind, yeah, he's only calling off. He's folding 82% of the time. No, sorry, that's the big blind. Let me go back. Sorry, I'm in the wrong part of the tree here. So he raises to 2 big blinds, and the 17 big blind stack shoves. And he is folding most of the time. He's only calling off with about 20% of his range.
Pretty much the same range that that Benny was.
Yeah. Whereas, let's say the big blind shoves on him. Well, you see, he's still folding almost half the time, which is interesting. That's probably more than most people think. But that's because the big blind is actually going to be fairly tight there. So when we have
the big blind is going to complete with all the mediocre hands.
Yeah, exactly. So when we have these kind of hands, like just junk, like King 8 off or Jack 5 suited, we'll actually just go ahead and fold.
Yeah.
But again, like we're not getting shoved on that much. In the same way that we saw that people are not going to play that back against Benny too much. The 4 guys behind him who are shorter are all kind of incentivized to just fold and hope somebody else gets it in against.
Yeah.
So the min raise will work quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so solver output here is fairly clear that it prefers the min raise and it doesn't like 4x or 6x. Although 4x is almost the same EV, so 4x would achieve. In practice, 4x might be better if the players adjust badly to it.
Yeah.
Again, it always depends on what the other players do.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I started playing online 12, 13 years ago, the 2.5 or 3x was just standard. And the only reason why I started 2xing was that I noticed that in the games that I was grinding at the time, 45 mans and full tilt, people just pressed the pre-fold buttons. So that means whether you raise 2x or 3x, you got the same folds. So I just thought, okay, well, people are going to fold the same amount. It took a while before people worked out that you had to defend much wider against 2x. Nowadays, I think people actually know their 2x defending ranges very well, because that's what they study.
Makes sense to like 3x and 4x to confuse them, right?
Yeah, but the 4x just confuses them. They obviously know they should defend a bit tighter, but they might over adjust or they might under adjust. So it's always the case, and we say this in our latest book, GTO Poker Simplified. It's not just about sticking rigidly to GTO. Sometimes if you do something which is slightly off GTO, the other players will actually make bigger mistakes. Like, again, if we go back to the EV of ace jack off, the difference between raising to 2 big blinds and raising to 4 big blinds is just over $200. But the mistakes the other players make against us, either pre-flop or post-flop, could amount to more than $200. So we could end up in practice making more money using this strategy. They might overfold pre-flop, or they might call with the wrong type of hands. Let's just look at the call briefly. We did already, but some people suggested that they thought kings might even be a fold to the shove. Now, Solver's basically saying kings is a fairly slam dunk call. It makes 97,358 or 356. It's actually advocating calling some of the time with queens as well. And Jack Hardcastle said to me that he would call with queens. I think there is actually an argument for going a bit wider than So maybe calling all the time with queens.
Mm-hmm.
The argument Jack put forward was that we're pretty much always going to be ahead, and if we do a hold, the stacks flip, and now we're going to win the tournament nearly always. We're in the same situation that Benny was before, and this is why I mentioned earlier when we were looking at the shove. This is why even if the shove was more profitable, I wouldn't take the shove in practice in Benny's spot. As a player who's perceived to be the best player at the table with the chip lead, you're going to win nearly always. When I asked top players ahead of how often they thought Benny was going to win from here, nobody went under 90%. The general consensus was Benny wins at least 90% of the time, and when he doesn't win, he comes second. But that was based on the assumption that he would use a small ball strategy.
Mm-hmm.
When happens is now obviously Benny was very unlucky. You can see here that the calling range is only 1% roughly. So he ran into the 1% of time Elliott gets dealt a hand he can call with, and he didn't get there against kings, which he's entitled to do some of the time with ace jack as well. So it is an outlier, but I think it's an unnecessary risk to take. I wrote a piece on this for Vegas Slots Online, in which I said that it's a bit like betting on 35 of the 36 numbers on a roulette wheel. Most of the time you'll win a small amount, but the one time you don't win, it's fairly catastrophic. So I think kind of the same logic applies here. Benny should be able to cruise to victory without taking any big risks. What this did is it flipped the situations completely. Actually, Benny is in a worse spot than Elliott was at the start, because Elliott had direct position on him.
Yeah. Also, but going back to the skill element of, if Elliott, he's a relatively new player, and if he is to concede that Benny is the better overall player, it's probably worth taking a minor equity gamble with a hand that's going to be strong, because it's that's your best opportunity to win 48 blinds off the best player at the table, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point. If it was close, I think we could advocate. Queens is obviously close since it's doing it some of the time and not doing it some of the time. If we look at ace king suited, you can see that ace king suited would actually lose 145,000 at equilibrium. I think that's too big of a loss to take. And somebody told me that actually Elliott correctly folded ace king due to ICM with about 10 players left.
Yeah.
So clearly Elliott was very ICM aware. As I believe we mentioned, I had run into him and he said that he'd read the 4 books and got a lot out of them. So we know that he read in-game poker strategy as well. He did appear to be very ICM aware. He also made a very marginal but correct call with ace queen with 7 players left. So it seems to me Elliott was very well versed in ICM. He also executed really well on the day. A lot of people would get scared in this spot and pretend they don't have kings and just fold.
He was very quick to call, very quick. Yeah,
but clearly he knew the spot and he knew it was a call, and he wasn't afraid. It's fairly gross when you see the ace jack, because you know now that almost 30% of the time you're going out in 6th.
Yeah.
But credit to Elliott. I think it will. It's a good sign of character that he was willing to call off there. If we look at some other hands, jacks might be close now. Like jacks, okay, in equilibrium it loses 57,000. But if you were really prioritizing winning the tournament and you didn't want to let Benny keep being able to, open a lot of hands, put a lot of pressure on post flop, etc., you wanted to go for the game changer. You could possibly make an argument for calling with jacks as well. By the time we go down to 10s, I guess it's getting worse. Yeah, 10s is almost as bad as ace king suited. So I think queens and jacks are the only light calls that we could advocate in this spot. But there's certainly an argument for it. All of these spots just don't take future equity into account. Benny is in an amazing spot as long as he has the chip lead. Every single hand he gets to open more hands. He gets to put more pressure on with small bets. He gets people to fold more to his all-ins. Whereas all the other players have to play very, very tight. If Elliott can flip it around as he did, he flips the script basically. Now he becomes the guy with all the advantages. So as happened in practice. Now, there is one other important point, which was actually brought up by David Lappin, which is like, what if we know that the calling range, that the shoving range is actually tighter than it should be?
Yeah.
So let's go back to the shoving range. And, this is what the solver is saying. Now, there's a very good chance this is the shoving range, or closer to the shoving range, or close to the shoving range, because Benny would have had access to solvers overnight and would have been able to run this spot, since the start happened right at the start of the final table.
And it makes sense too. Like, Benny's not going to open shove aces or kings. That's a total waste of a big hand.
Exactly. He's not going to shove all. Clearly, most of this range is uncontroversial. He's not shoving aces, kings, queens, etc. It's the hands in blue that he's supposed to shove. Ace jack off is actually just above that.
It's actually purple. It's purple, Dara. Sorry, I know you're colorblind.
I am colorblind. I just took a wild guess there. It was blue. So we can speculate on whether maybe Benny's range is a bit stronger than it should be, because we know for a fact Ace jack off is in there. And that is stronger. And maybe Benny doesn't shove Queen 3 suited or Queen 4 suited.
Exactly. Those
types of hands. So now we're going to do some node locking. So we're going to edit his range. So we're going to say, okay, well, he seems to be shoving. Maybe he's shoving all the aces all the time.
Yeah, I'd say that's
and he's going up as high as Ace jack off. Maybe he's not shoving Ace queen off, or maybe we'll give it some weighting. So let's say he shoves Ace queen off half the time. And similarly, we'll assume he shoves all of these suited aces. And maybe Ace 10 suited gets shoved as well, since it's the one above the range. And maybe Ace jack suited gets shoved some of the time. And we'll assume he shoves king, queen suit. All these hands up here that are partial shoves, let's assume he shoves them all. But let's take out some of the weaker ones. So let's say he doesn't shove 7-5 suited. He doesn't shove Queen 3 suited. He doesn't shove Queen 4 suited. Maybe not King 2 suited. 5-4 suited. We'll just take out some of these hands, and maybe make this the range. So now we get the lock symbol here to show that this range has been locked. And now we run the Nash card.
Queens.
It's changed very little, yeah. Okay, Ace King suited now is even worse, and Queens calls. Yeah. Okay, so this is the new calling range, and actually it's very little changed, and that's largely because, like, I mean, even the strongest hands that we added in have kind of the same equity as the weaker hands we took out.
Yeah, like Ace rag or King rag has still got the same equity against queens, for example. Pretty much, it's got one free outer or something.
Yeah, exactly. So we all that's happened is the solver's calling with queens slightly more often now, and it thinks calling with Ace King suited is even worse than it was. Let's look at jacks. Jacks was 50 something. Jacks is about the same as well. Yeah. So the pairs have pretty much held their equity because they're usually well ahead. So the range doesn't matter too much. Now what we're going to do is we're going to unlock this range, and we're going to say, okay, well, what if Elliot calls even wider?
Yeah.
There's the Jack Hardcastle argument for, well, let's call wider, because we'll win the tournament more. So let's say he always calls with queens, and he always calls with jacks, because he's just willing to take his shot. And let's say he calls half the time with Ace King suited. And a quarter of the time with Ace King off.
Other players, I'd put Ace King suited as 100% call, but we know Elliot's folded it one time before, so he's.
I think in practice, Elliot is not calling Ace King because, as I said, we know he made a good fold with Ace King before the final table, and we know he's read the book too. So. And now the This is the shoving range again. Ace jack off is still not a shove.
Mhm.
And it's roughly the same difference.
Yeah.
$400 to $500 in the difference between min raising and shoving. So it doesn't make that big of a difference.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the major takeaway here is that the ace jack off shove is profitable, but it's not optimal, at least according to the solvers.
Mhm.
Even if the solvers were going the other way and saying shoving was made $500 more than min raising, I would still advocate the min raise for all the reasons I said earlier.
Yeah,
it just keeps the chip lead. We don't risk the chip lead.
Yeah. Yeah, and Benny's skill advantage as well.
Benny's skill advantage playing down the streets, playing post flop, all that stuff. Whereas when he lost his hand, Benny was put into the ICM coffin, and I think he had. I think he was probably very relieved to make second in the end.
Yeah.
His chances of winning the tournament diminished greatly, and his chances of not making the top two were significant. He probably had a higher chance of finishing outside the top two spots than he had of actually winning the tournament at that point, which again is another reason for just don't take the spot in the first place.
Mm-hmm. So unlucky to Benny, obviously a very, very talented player, and he was almost certainly going to crush this final table had he not run into kings. Well done to Elliot. He knows his in-game poker strategy, the ICM book, very, very well. And thank you, Dara.
Thanks, Barry. Very interesting hand to analyze.